This is section 3 of the syllables handout, where we're talking about codas and licensing, and this comes back to a point I was making earlier in class that in many languages, when you look at different kinds of phonological rules or contrasts or neutralizations, anything like that, you often find that the context end of a word and before a consonant, or sometimes just before a non-sonorant consonant, either one, that these often pattern together in many different languages. And so in section 3, I'm showing you an example from the Hayes text in Cibaeño Spanish. So this is a variety of Spanish. I think it's spoken in the Dominican Republic. And it has a liquid gliding process. What does that mean? Well, liquids optionally or variably can turn into glides in some contexts in Cibaeño. And so, for instance, here are some contexts. Am I still on the board? Yeah. So in a word like what would normally be carta in most varieties of Spanish, where this would be something like an apical tap, this also has the realization kaita in Cibaeño. This means card, I guess, or letter, rather. Yeah, and so what do we find going on here? Well, sometimes these liquids are turning into glides. Okay, so what? Is it any liquid? No. So in between two vowels, in a word like pare, which means stop, it's a command, here there's no option to turn this into a glide, so you can't get something like paye. It doesn't work, right? Similarly, this happens with the lateral liquid as well. So in a word like papel, and I'm going to show you here the end of the word as well. So this is true of both segments before a stop like this or at the end of a word. You get alternations, or rather variation, between papel and papel. Right? So again, liquid becomes a glide. Yeah, again, this doesn't happen in between vowels or before a vowel. So in a word like limite, you don't get yimite. Okay, so what is going on in this variety of Spanish? Well, it's clear there's going to be some sort of a rule that turns a sonorant consonant that's a liquid into a glide. Right? And so Hayes writes this out as a plus sonorant plus continuant consonant becomes, well, he cheats and doesn't use features here. He just uses the IPA symbol ya. If you wanted to, you could go look up the features of ya and rewrite the rule using natural classes. It's basically going to need to become minus consonantal. And then possibly some place of articulation changes, or minus lateral, things like that. The exact features of the sonorants are a little bit complicated. In any case, it's going to turn into a ya sound. Where is it going to do that? Well, it's before a consonant, it looks like, or at the end of a word. Right? So we can do this thing that we did in class, right? Where we do the brackets for the context, where it's either before a consonant or at the end of a word. But as I mentioned in class, this is usually taken as a sign that something has gone wrong, right? We don't want our theory to be able to do this. So is there a good alternative? Well, if we were going to syllabify here, how would we do it? In a word like carta, there's going to be two syllables here, two syllabic sounds, the two vowels, and then we're going to try to parse things right into the onset. So ta is no problem. It's a possible word beginning in Spanish. Ka is no problem. Ka is a possible word beginning in Spanish. What about erta? No, absolutely not. So that's not a possible word beginning in Spanish. Instead, this is going to need to go into the preceding syllable. In other words, it's a coda. Here, on the other hand, because, well, some version of ra is a possible word beginning in Spanish, right? We can parse this into the onset. This is not in coda position. and it never changes to a glide. Similarly, obviously, if it's at the end of a word, this has to be a coda of that final syllable in papel. So again, we find possible gliding when the consonant's in coda position, but, at the beginning of a word, obviously, it can't be in coda position, has to be in onset position. 3 syllables in this one. And so in onset position, right, as opposed to coda position, we never get this gliding process. Another way of saying this is that the rule applies, right? Liquids can become the palatal glide at the end of a syllable, right? When they're adjacent to a syllable boundary. Adjacent to a syllable ending boundary, not when they're at the beginning of a syllable, right? It doesn't work that way. It has to be next to a syllable ending and not next to a syllable beginning. In other words, the rule applies in coda position, right? And so this is nice because now we can specify the context for the rule without having to use this crazy formalism, which we don't like. In other words, we're getting to keep our rule component a little bit simpler. We were hoping that we wouldn't have to add this device into our phonological rules because you can write all kinds of crazy things using that kind of a formalism, and we don't see rules like that in across the world's languages, except for ones that apply in this disjunctive context, right? So we're glad to simplify our rule component by getting rid of this. In order to do that, well, we have to complicate our representational component a little bit. Namely, we have to have syllable theory and syllable structure in order to get this rule to work out nicely. And most linguists have traditionally found that to be a good trade-off, right? So most people believe in syllable structure. We sometimes end up, and we saw this earlier when I tried to show you some cross-linguistic things in class, we sometimes end up with consonants that can't be syllabified according to the syllabification principles of a language at all. And the question is, what happens to those consonants? And one possible answer is, well, just words like that are ungrammatical, right? So we saw a case like that I guess for English, right, with the pathmolet type examples in class. There are other possibilities, though, if you can zero in on some underlying representations that give you unsyllabifiable consonant sequences, you can find different things happening. Hayes gives an example in the chapter from Yawomani, showing a penthesis to deal with unsyllabifiable or stray consonants. A more common thing, or at least a very common thing, is called stray erasure, right? So you take these stray consonants and you just delete them. And so the Hayes text again gives an example from Spanish, and I'm picking up all the Spanish examples because we have so many Spanish speakers in the class. It's nice to see. And so here is the idea. In Spanish, you can get an input form, a UR, like esculp, plus the morpheme tura. And so this is going to mean sculpture in Spanish, where esculpir is the verb to sculpt. I hope I got the vowel right at the end, but it's either esculpir or esculper. I don't remember which. But anyway, you can show that pa is in the underlying representation of the verb stem. So the input's going to be something like this, right? And then it has this tura suffix, which is a lot like English ture, T-U-R-E suffix, which itself comes from Latin, so not surprising, Latin and French. This is a suffix. And the question is, what do you do here? Well, you assign, again, syllable heads to each plus syllabic sound. This has 4 syllables, escultura in Spanish. And then we do our onset formation, so no problem with the rhotic sound, no problem with a t, no problem with a k. You can't get sk sequences at the beginning of a word in Spanish, so this guy's going to have to go in a coda. You can't get pt sequences in Spanish. You can get l at the end of a word, so that's a possible coda, es cool, but you never get ol p sequences at the end of a word in Spanish. So this p consonant can't syllabify in the coda of the preceding syllable. It can't syllabify in the onset of the following syllable. And in Spanish, it just deletes, right? So this is referred to as stray consonant erasure or just stray erasure. And it happens in a number of languages. So what comes out here is not escultura, but escultura. So that looks nice and neat, right? It does a nice job explaining why this form alternates, right? Because if you put a vowel here, as in the verbal infinitive, esculpir, this appears. But if you put a consonant here, as in the suffix tura, it disappears. And this is a nice explanation of why it can't be syllabified according to the principles of Spanish word beginnings and word endings. Therefore, Spanish has a rule that just deletes it because it can't be syllabified. But here's an issue, right? This is basically telling you, again, just like we started with, the reason you should believe in syllable theory is because it helps relate facts about things that happen in the middles of words to things that happen at the edges of words. Namely, in this case, there are no pt words in Spanish, and there are no words that end in ulp in Spanish. And that's how we know that this thing needs to have something done to it, right? It's, again, relating these different facts from different areas of Spanish phonotactics, except if you look much further beyond this type of thing, you'll find that this doesn't actually work for many, many Spanish words. And in fact, the relationship between word edges and word middles in Spanish is really messy and doesn't work according to syllable theory very well at all. So here are a bunch of grammatical words in Spanish. Raptura, that means rapture. Lectura, that means lecture. These are some pretty simple examples. So in these cases, you have two voiceless stops in a row. This is pretty common in Spanish. Here's the problem. Here's lectura, which means reading, right? Okay. So we have three syllables, lectura, lectura. Okay. Syllable, syllable, syllable. And then we're going to do onset formation. So ra, no problem. Ta, no problem. La, no problem. These are all possible word beginnings in Spanish. Kta is not a possible word beginning in Spanish, so we can't parse this into the following syllable. And ka is also not a possible word ending in Spanish. There are a few cases, maybe, of a word final ka in recent loan words from English. But even there, it's dispreferred. And there are also a number of loan words from English, I think, where you get a vowel apenticized after a word final ka. So Spanish clearly, in its native vocabulary, does not allow ka to be the end of a word. Therefore, this should be an unsyllabifiable consonant, and according to this rule, we should find deletion of it, and we should have lectura as the output form here. That's not what happens. These sequences kta and pta are perfectly well formed in Spanish, despite the fact that they do not consist of a possible word ending followed by a possible word beginning. Maybe you can finesse that or solve it by saying, well, what the loan words from English show is that Spanish grammar is in a state of changing where it's suddenly going to allow stops at the end of the word, and this is reflecting that grammar. But the problem is that words like this came into Spanish hundreds of years ago, long before there were any English loan words like check or TikTok or things like that. And so you'd still have to explain why this was acceptable at an earlier stage of Spanish grammar, and it can't be related to contemporary English loan words. And also, this is not the only kind of sequence that works this way in Spanish. Instead, there's a pretty systematic mismatch between word endings and beginnings on the one hand and word middles on the other hand, where you get many more sequences of consonants word medially in Spanish. than you would find at the ends or beginnings of words. So in general, I mean, this is without even looking at a corpus or a dictionary. This is just based on my mediocre knowledge of the Spanish lexicon. It's easy to come up with sequences like bstra, right, or gda, that appear medially in Spanish words that are totally impossible as word endings or word beginnings, or as a sequence of word ending followed by word beginning. So this one, the bstra sequence in a word like abstracto, right, which means abstract, is absolutely impossible, right? So you can have tra as a word beginning. You can't have stra. And you definitely can't have basa as a word ending. In fact, you can't even have ba as a word ending in Spanish. Again, except for recent English language loans, like snob, I guess, is borrowed as a snob. But other than that, these are absolutely not allowable in word final position in Spanish. And so, I mean, what do we think about this? Well, I told you earlier that sometimes people take syllable theory as a primitive of phonology, and then the goal is to figure out how we're going to analyze everything in terms of syllables. I don't do that in this class, and part of the reason for that is precisely because you miss things like this if you start out with the assumption that everything's in syllables and our job is to figure out how the syllables work. Right? Another way of looking at this is that syllables make predictions about what kinds of consonant sequences can and can't appear in the middles of words in relation to word edges, and sometimes those predictions are right, but sometimes they're wrong. Right? And Spanish is not unique in this regard. In fact, many languages seem to either allow more consonants internal to a word than you would predict, or fewer consonants internal to a word than you would predict based on word edges. And so one way of approaching this is to say, well, these are syllable phenomena, but you need to say something special about some kinds of syllables, like maybe there's a special syllable appendix position that only pops up in the middles of words or only pops up at the ends of words. Or this is actually a real proposal out there. Maybe in languages that allow more things at the edges of words, it's because there's a silent syllable head at the edge of a word, right? And you can make up representational hypotheses like these all day long, but you're losing this original goal of transparently tying together different areas of phonotactics within a language. So I think it's equally important to look at phenomena like these and also consider the possibility that these are telling you that your theory of syllabification, or the theory by which all of these rules and alternations and generalizations depend on syllables, that it might not be the right theory. Right? And so that's why I wait until late in this class to present syllabification. And it's because I want to keep a skeptical mindset here, right? So syllables are useful to the extent that they help us tie together different facts from different areas of phonological grammar. To the extent they fail to do so, they are no longer useful as a theoretical device, right? And so it's worth keeping a mental tally in our heads. Which things are syllables good for? Which things are they not good for? Because they're not a primitive of the theory. They are a hypothesis that is subject to testing like any other structural hypothesis in linguistics.